Wonderful. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Harnessing the Contribution of International Agricultural Trade for Sustainable Food Systems. To start, a few light housekeeping rules. The event is being recorded and will be made available on YouTube next week. By remaining on the webinar, you agree to being recorded. We're very pleased to have interpretation available for this session. And if you do require English to Spanish interpretation, please select the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen to activate the channel. We invite you during this event to use the Q&A function to post any questions, and the host will be in direct contact with you. You will also have the raise hand function, and as of now, you are all muted. If you have a question and are asked to speak, our technical team will provide you with permission to unmute yourself. Due to these COVID times, we're all used to these video conference and these events, so some of their common hiccups are frequent, and we have measures in place to help maintain the integrity of the call. So should there be a disturbance, please bear with us and we'll restore order promptly. So now I am happy to hand it over to our distinguished moderator for the session, Dr. Máximo Torrero, the Chief Economist of FAO. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it's a great pleasure for me to participate in this event and offer the opening remarks on the role of the trade, as well as on the role of complementary policies in the needed food system transformation. So food systems are facing an array of challenges, as all of you know, relating to population growth, demographic changes, and rising inequalities, but also climate change and natural resource degradation, and of course, to increasing hunger and all forms of malnutrition. The COVID-19 pandemic has aggravated the situation even further, with resulting economic recessions raising very serious concerns about the future. According to the 2021 edition of our flagship SOFI report, between 720 and 811 million people in the world suffer from chronic hunger in 2020. If we consider the middle range, 768 million, then we have 188 million more people that face hunger in 2020 than in 2019. That is a very large number. So conflict, climate variability, and extremes and economic slowdowns and downturns exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic are the major drivers of food insecurity and malnutrition in the world. In this context, it is therefore clear that there is an urgent need to support a transition to more efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable agri-food systems that achieve a better balance between economic, social, and environmental objectives as stipulated in the 2030 Agenda and SDGs. Trade can play an important role and is an important tool in this regard. It is an integral part of agri-food systems and an important enabler for the food system transformation. And let me show a couple of slides to show exactly what I mean. This slide that I am showing here is the number of food groups that with insufficient domestic supply. If you look at the number, the darker the color, the bigger the number of the foods which are insufficient available in those countries, you will see that in Africa, Sub-Saharan, and many parts in Asia and South Asia, and in some countries in Latin America, we are facing a significant challenge, meaning that those countries don't produce the food groups that they need to be able to have access to healthy diets. And this is very consistent to the 3 billion people that don't have access today to healthy diets. So this is basically telling us that unless food can move across the board, it will be impossible to provide access to healthy diets to these countries, and therefore it's central. And the second figure that I wanted to show is the level of trade distortions on healthy diets. So we have 3 billion people not having access to healthy diets. But look at the level of distortions we have, especially in the countries that have the less access in terms of access to healthy diets. So again, the point I'm trying to make with these two figures is how important trade is to be able to minimize those. Because trade connects people at all stages of the agri-food value chains and links producers with consumers by connecting supply to demand and promoting food security and greater diversity of diets. It is for these reasons that trade is recognized as an important means of implementation for the achievement of the SDGs, including SDG 2 on zero hunger. While trade can be a crucial enabler of food system transformation, there is no doubt that it can also be associated with negative externalities that can undermine the achievements of sustainability objectives. These are what we call the trade-offs that we need to address and we need to minimize. For example, some producers will not be able to compete with imported products, resulting in loss of income and livelihoods. In other cases, lower prices of food can make it harder for producers to bear the cost of complying with climate-smart agricultural practices. To mitigate these risks and harness the full benefit of trade, it is important to ensure a coherent, aligned policies across a host of policy areas, including trade, agriculture, environment, health, technology, and education. For example, policies that promote trade liberalization and market integration need to be together by adequate safety net measures and risk mitigating programs to protect populations that will be affected by import competition. In addition, agricultural development programs that promote productivity improvement together with public investments in marketing and trade infrastructure and the adoption of digital technologies are also vital towards this direction. In this regard, and in order for trade to play its important role in the food system transformation, non-distorted trade, properly functioning global agricultural markets, and universal, rules-based, open, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading systems under the WTO, as stipulated in SDG 17, are essential. FAO has been active in discussions in the Food System Summit with regard to trade, and a number of game-changing solutions could be identified in this regard. And we also have published a paper with a scientific group on this topic. The critical role of information and transparency in reducing uncertainty and avoiding ill-informed decisions and counterproductive policy responses is one of them. Global food market transparency could be increased by, for example, extending the work of the Agricultural Market Information System, the AMIS, to cover agricultural input markets and other commodities, and expanding initiatives, monitoring, and analytical work to include global food trade, logistics, and checkpoints. Moreover, the need to enhance the adoption of trade facilitation measures, including digital solutions in exchange of trade documents and SPS certificates, traceability systems, green channels, and pre-arrival clearance systems, and e-commerce platforms, can remove unnecessary constraints on trade in food products, which is also important to stress. Finally, another key area of action to maximize the potential for trade that was brought up refers to the reorientation of agricultural policies. In this regard, and in order to ensure that food system transformation achieves the appropriate balance between economic, social, and environmental dimensions, requires that WTO rules are consistently revised and adjusted as needed. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward for the very interesting discussion and panel that we have after it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Torrero. We are happy to have His Excellency Ambassador Alexandre Guido Lopez Parola. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. And thank you, Mr. Torrero, for your opening speech. Allow me also to thank the organizers for the invitation to take part in the session. Allow me to start quoting the joint statement submitted by Brazil and 15 other co-sponsors to Her Excellency Amina Mohamed, Deputy UN Secretary General, and to Her Excellency Agnes Kalibata, Special Envoy to the 2021 Food System Summit last March, called, and I quote, "The contribution of international agricultural trade to sustainable food systems." In a very concise and precise way, it assessed the contribution of international agricultural trade to the food systems transformation. In its introductory page, it affirms, and I quote, "Open trade plays a vital part in ensuring and supporting global food security." Dr. Okonjo Iweala, Director General of the WTO, highlighted exactly the same idea in her opening remarks to the Global Dialogue on Trade earlier this month, which was also part of the preparatory process to the Food System Summit. You're probably familiar with this piece of data, but it's worth to emphasize it. 1 in every 6 people around the world depends almost entirely on international trade for the food they eat. So trade can not only contribute for sustainable food systems, in fact, it plays an essential role. This message is very important to convey and to be heard, as during the pandemic, calls for increasing resilience have often been interpreted as the need to reshore critical supply chains and increase self-sufficiency to reduce dependence on global markets. This is also the reason why trade should be one of the pillars of the Food System Summit. I'm glad to see that due to the efforts of Brazil and other like-minded countries and organizations, we have been able to reposition trade in these discussions. The organization of the Food System Summit is very timely as we are facing this one in a lifetime challenge, the COVID-19 pandemic. According to FAO, almost 10% of the world population suffered from undernourishment in 2020, a significant increase caused by the context of pandemic. The multilateral trading system and the WTO are engaged in facing this challenge. Combating COVID-19 and its effects on our economies and societies will be at the center of the next WTO Ministerial Conference in December, the MC12. So will agriculture and food security issues. Food security, food availability, and sustainable food systems rely on the reform of international trade rules. The adoption of the Agreement on Agriculture during the Uruguay round was a significant milestone for establishing a fair and market-oriented agricultural trading system. But according to its own preamble and Article 22, the AOA was not the end of the reform process. On the contrary, it mandated the continuation of the reform in favor of substantial progressive reductions in support and protection. Since 1995, progress has been modest, we must recognize. The elimination of export subsidies in Nairobi in 2015 was a significant achievement in line with SDG 2, but it did not come along with progress in the other two AOA's pillars, domestic support and market access. Currently, agriculture remains the most protected and the most distorted sector globally. Tariffs are higher and non-tariff barriers are more widespread in agriculture than in any other economic sector. More significantly, subsidies to agricultural production have been a tool for transferring income from consumers and resource poor producers, mainly from the developing world, to a handful of wealthy and large-scale producers. Food systems will not be sustainable in any of the three dimensions of sustainable development if trade and production distorting domestic support entitlements reach $2 trillion in 2030. And this is what's going to happen if they're left unchecked. Food security solutions are not limited to and should not ideally be addressed through mechanisms that can make agricultural trade even more protected and distorted. Reducing, not imposing new barriers to trade and market distortions is a critical pathway to enable countries to raise incomes and standards of living, to promote food security, provide employment, fight climate change, and ensure sustainable development and transforming food systems. Brazil will keep fighting for the conclusion of the reform process in agricultural trade rules to fulfill not only the mandate of AOA, but also SDG 2's target of correcting and preventing trade restrictions and distortions in world agricultural markets. I'm confident that as part of the efforts towards the transformation of the food systems, the WTO will deliver substantive agricultural outcome in its next ministerial conference, especially in domestic support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your support on this event and more importantly, for Brazil's leadership on this topic. We're definitely looking to you and hoping that many more countries will join it. Now, let me call on Mrs. Jane Chisholm-Kant, the Director General of the Grain and Feed Trade Association. Mrs. Kant, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone. My name is Jane Chisholm-Kant and I'm the Director General of GAFTA. GAFTA is an international trade association representing nearly 2,000 companies in 100 countries around the globe who trade in agri-commodities. It's estimated that 80% of the world's trade in grain is shipped on GAFTA contracts. I'm also a past chair of the private sector mechanism at the UN Committee on World Food Security. It's my pleasure to be speaking with you today at this affiliated event during the pre-summit, because it is simply impossible to discuss food systems and food security without acknowledging the vital role of international trade. As noted by WTO Director Akonjo Iweala, international trade is vital for global food security, as trade is necessary to move food from parts of our planet that have a food surplus to the parts that have a food deficit. The reality is that no one country is entirely self-sufficient in food. We believe the positive potential of trade can be discussed more in detail through the food systems process. And to this end, we are hopeful that this event will signal a change and cause more governments and stakeholders to continue to stress that the elimination and correction of unjustified trade barriers to agricultural products and trade distorting agricultural subsidies be considered game-changing by the summit, in line with SDGs. International trade in food and feed has a symbiotic relationship with local production and connects smallholders to domestic markets and ultimately the world. Together, the local, regional, and international supply chains form resilient trade ecosystems, which have demonstrated their importance and robustness during the COVID-19 pandemic. Trade has been identified as one of the solutions and not one of the obstacles to global food security in the midst of the pandemic, according to WTO leadership. With the recently released SOFI report revealing an increase in hunger by 161 million, there is no clearer reminder that we need to sharpen our focus on how to facilitate free-flowing trade. Trade also supports diverse diets and ensures that local climatic or geopolitical events are not exacerbated by hunger. We need to sustainably nourish a growing population of 7 billion people today to one of 9 billion in 2050. Increasing global food security in the midst of climate change also means that the right crops must be grown in the most productive places. We believe that global food security is best served when free and open markets allow crops to be raised in environments where they can be grown most efficiently, productively, and sustainably, and then shipped to areas where they are needed, thereby reducing the need for land, inputs, energy, and other natural resources. We need to consider all of the factors that contribute to producing food in a more efficient and environmentally sustainable way. Food miles alone are not a proxy for carbon footprints. Sustainable agricultural development has the potential to improve livelihoods, lift people out of poverty, and advance human health and nutrition. It can also fuel greater self-sufficiency and serve as a foundation for increased political and economic stability in fragile states. There is much that governments can do to encourage domestic, regional, and international trade, which contributes to family incomes as well as national GDP. GAFTA believes that regulatory decision-making on food and feed safety should be based on sound science. We also support the use of international standards, such as those developed by Codex Alimentarius for maximum residue levels. Unilateral action in this area, for example, can disproportionately affect small farmers if the import tolerance for a substance is changed mid-growing season. Governments working together have shown great resourcefulness and solidarity during the pandemic by classifying port operatives and others as key workers and allowing for greater acceptance of electronic documents. We hope to see more collaborative actions between public and private sectors, as well as governments and civil society, both here and as we move towards the UN Food Systems Summit in September, where we hope the important role of trade in global food security will be recognised. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for those valuable points. Now I'm happy to have Dr. Jared Greenville, the Acting Executive Director at the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Sciences. Dr. Greenville, thank you for joining. Over to you. I believe you need to unmute. My apologies, Dr. Greenville. I believe there's an audio issue. I believe I'm not the only one who cannot hear you. Perhaps we give you a moment. Do you have, for example, a mute button on your headset? The audio issue remains, Dr. Greenville. I'm going to do this. Let's move to Director Ung to take the floor while we resolve your audio issues, which may be your headset. So just a few moments. I am going to turn to Director Ung. Would you mind taking the floor and delivering your remarks while we resolve Dr. Greenville's issue?
Hello, hi, my name is Lynn. I am the Global Head of Commodities, Food and Agri of ING Bank. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session.
Thank you for joining, Director Ung. Over to you.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Lynn. I'm the Global Head for Commodities, Food and Agri of ING Bank. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. Just to check that you're hearing me all right.
Yes, we are.
Perfect. Okay. Well, the nice thing about starting somewhere in the later part of the session is that all the good points have already been harped upon and taken. So let me just highlight a couple of facts. First, Mother Nature has dictated that food is produced optimally in different countries, in different locations, in different seasons and conditions. And very often, as my colleagues have just mentioned, the area of production is different from where it is being consumed. And as such, you cannot escape the fact that physical trade is a necessity. And as also alluded to by my colleagues before me, we are better off accepting the laws of nature and to focus on optimizing the production and facilitating the distribution. Any effort that is not spent on these areas will only lead to increased costs and inefficiencies. And in fact, the traders play a very important role in balancing the supply and demand. Across the locations, taking as an example, the soybeans that are being produced by Brazil to where it is being consumed, and a large market is in China. Another example is to balance the supply and demand across time, storing during the times of abundant supply, be it due to seasonalities or simply a good harvest, for consumption at a later stage when the supply is lower. Their role as a trader is to smoothen out the sudden disruptions for both the producers and the consumers. To facilitate trade, trust and transparency are key ingredients. An open ecosystem is a requirement. People just need to be able to trust that as long as they produce and deliver a safe product, that they will be paid decently and quickly. To achieve this, we need a robust ecosystem for trade with internationally accepted standards for production, be it for food safety, quality, or ESG purposes. And secondly, we also need internationally accepted standards for the evidence, for the exchange of evidence that delivery has been made and payment has been made. This needs to be transparent, trusted, and efficient. So we need to work together to remove all the trade obstacles and keep it as simple as possible. In this regard, it is actually quite shocking to think about how backward trade ecosystems have been, that we are still dealing with stacks and stacks of documents. In fact, the irony of it is that it sometimes takes the documents a longer time to arrive than the goods itself. Now, when the COVID pandemic first escalated, I can share with you an example in real life. The initial confusion that we had at the banks was not where the goods were, but where were the documents and how are we going to get our hands on it? Simply because the couriers could not deliver the documents to the banks. And one of the good outcomes, if we can count it as a blessing from the COVID pandemic, although it's not ideal, is that there was an increased acceptance of e-documentation. And that has led to increased efficiency. A great example is the implementation of the IPCC e-Phyto solution by Australia, Brazil, and the EU. With this, customs clearance was a lot more efficient, and that helped to enable the timely delivery of food staples. And there's a lot more that needs to be done with regards to the digitalization. We need neutral governance bodies to define and administer standards and to manage disputes. This is where the work that is being done by ICC's Digital Standards Initiative is very important and very timely. There needs to be policy coherence, there needs to be harmony in the trade standards. We need to work together and eliminate all the trade barriers. I firmly believe that digitalization is a vital step towards building a resilient trade ecosystem, and that it's ultimately important, and that is ultimately important to ensuring the resilience of the food supply system. The need to move quickly and nimbly is only escalating. We only need to look at the dramatic weather changes that we are seeing. Therefore, this session is a timely call for action and collaboration between the governments and businesses. I really look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for giving some concrete examples on how we can overcome and use this particular environment and situation as an opportunity. I would like to give the floor back to Dr. Greenville. Hopefully we have resolved the issue. Over to you.
Fingers crossed, second time a charm, hopefully. Yeah, got a good thing, fingers up, so that's a good thing. So thanks very much for the opportunity to be involved in this. Really appreciate the offer. As I talk, I was going to refer to a number of reports and statistics, and I'll try and copy some of those links into the chat for those who are interested and can follow up. The first observation I'd like to make is around where we produce food. As shown in the introduction, food production and consumption often have a geographical difference. Underlying this is differences in production and the different capacities and underlying resources of different regions. A key question that kind of drops out from that for policymakers in the multilateral space is, you know, if we had no borders, where would we produce food? And the obvious answer to that is in locations where it's most sustainable and efficient to do so and where the right environment exists. Trade and the rules-based global system are key elements that help us move to that situation where we're producing food most sustainably. What is more is that we know that the global climate is changing, and that's going to flow through to changes in food production. We need a system that allows for shifts in production without unnecessary costs being imposed on consumers and producers. This will be important for food security, rural incomes, and economic growth more broadly. So climate-related shocks are likely to negatively impact agricultural yields and agricultural production more generally. As an example, close to home in Australia here, we've seen that shifts in our climate over the past 20 years have decreased farm profitability by around 23%. For us, at least our farmers have kept pace with that shift in climate through productivity improvements, but it really points to the challenge posed by climate change. At the national level, climate-related shocks will require more diverse sources of supply, and businesses will be further incentivized to invest in global food value chains to secure supply. Again, an open and rules-based trading system will help facilitate shifts in agricultural production and rural incomes while minimizing the disruptive impacts that this can have on the food system and livelihoods. This does not mean that adjustments in rural activity will not occur and production is likely to shift, but rather that the trade system will help us facilitate that while keeping the system overall sustainable. Governments continue to have a role in this space, ensuring that people don't get left behind. But this does not mean that we should hold on to inefficient and unsustainable production systems. Neither of these options actually prevent people from falling behind. As an example, Australia has reformed its approach to agricultural support over time, particularly since the 1990s. in line with our own national competition policy and other pro-competitive reforms, and consistent with WTO obligations. These policy measures support farmers and rural communities to stop sustainable production practices, and have led to a situation where we're achieving better environmental outcomes. It also has increased our producers' ability to cope with risk, and that's really important for Australia as we operate in one of the most risky areas in the world. What we know already is that the current system of trade and domestic support policy changes the location of production. So we're already working against this aim of putting production where it's most efficient to do so. We know that these changes are not for the better. Some OECD research has shown that the global food system and the global production in the global food system is not greater because of our current levels of support and trade barriers. And overall, it's potentially lower. So not only are we producing things in the wrong location, but we're also producing less than we could otherwise. And this really can be reformed through the changes to our support processes. With those rising pressures that Maximo put forward quite eloquently around the food system, and more work to be done to address food security, we really must do better in this regard. The other thing is worth, I think, highlighting is, from an export perspective, from an Australian perspective, we've seen how a commitment to open markets and trade has ensured supply really during a black swan event such as COVID. Australia's been able to maintain its production, exports and imports despite challenges posed by COVID-19. We're a fairly highly interconnected production system to global supply chains, particularly for our imports. And this is one demonstration that an interconnected food system can deliver in times of crisis. This is part of really a more fundamental point. For countries and regions, even when we expect disruptions to occur in international markets from shocks such as COVID, it is important that growth in production and rural incomes, that we stay connected. Recent research by my organisation has pointed out the costs of partially withdrawing from the global food system, noting that they are really quite high, and essentially it's really a false insurance policy. So beyond supply, there are broader measures around sustainability when we don't have open trading systems. Trade policy can promote sustainability to the extent that it enables the efficient and uninterrupted flow of food, as well as inputs into agricultural production system. It does this through ensuring strong but fair global competition, which forces industries to continually drive for productivity improvements and make sure that they are offering a sustainable and low-cost product. Multilateral trading rules do play a really strong facilitating role in this, ensuring that markets remain open and the commercial signals are amplified at the producer level. And that includes consumer demands and preferences, ensuring that our food system is producing what people want. They can also leave governments enough policy space to adopt innovative solutions to sustainability challenges. So I will leave it there for now and look forward to participating in questions later. And hopefully I stay online.
Thank you, Jared, for those really stark facts and based by research and science to frame the discussion. So our panel has ended here of speakers, and we are going to start our interactive moment. And I'm happy to count on Dr. Torero to moderate. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, and thank you so much to the panelists. Let me go directly to the questions, and I will try to assign each question to each of you. Jane, there is a question here saying, with the demand for food exports increasing, how to stimulate production for domestic consumption in developing countries?
Thank you, Dr. Torero. I think there's a number of things that can be done. I mean, first of all, as a number of the panelists, including myself, has mentioned, there's an important role about growing the right crops in the right area. I think it's very important to have government support and also to access the best-in-class knowledge and scientific techniques, as well as being promoting the use of climate smart agricultural practices to ensure that the crops are grown in the most sustainable way. I think also to look at, certainly as I had mentioned before, how to develop that relationship between local producers, local markets, and then the potential, if necessary, to link up with regional and international markets. And I think the questioner also posed a comment in the questions as well about reducing food loss as well. So obviously that would also need to be having a look at, is this an infrastructure problem in terms of produce isn't able to get to market quick enough? You know, what are the reasons behind that? So I mean, clearly it's an issue that needs to be addressed, but there isn't just one solution. It's going to require, you know, a sort of a very holistic view to increase domestic production. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Parola, how can a reform in multilateral trade disciplines on agriculture contribute to food system transformation? And what do you think will be a successful outcome of the MC12?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Brazil has tabled recently a document with 9 items, which we think are fundamental to define what should be the deliverables of MC12. And among them is a substantial reduction of domestic support. We think this is essential. There was a time in which, I mean, if you look at agricultural markets today, it's completely different from what it was 20 years ago. So the level of subsidies has increased, the members of countries subsidizing has dramatically changed. So we think that nowadays domestic support is something that goes against poverty alleviation, goes against sustainability, and certainly goes against producing food as cheap as possible. So one of the results we envisage is a substantial reduction of domestic support. We have been discussing this with the Cairns Group, with the Group of Ottawa. We have put together a proposal, which is a very balanced proposal. It assumes a reduction of subsidies across time proportionally. It's a very well thought proposal. So we hope we get traction around this idea. This is one of the main deliverables for us.
Thank you so much. Let me pass now to Lynn. Can you share some recent examples of resilient trade ecosystems in the current COVID-19 environment? And also how you think market information asymmetries between the producer and the off-takers can be reduced, and what advice can you give to businesses in developing countries in Africa?
Sure, Dr. Torero, thanks for the question. Yeah, some of the most resilient trade ecosystems during the current COVID-19 environment were the food staples, things like grains, oilseeds, plants, plant-based trade, specifically in grains. Why? Because these are food staples that really impact the fundamental food securities of many countries. Thus, it incentivizes these countries to increase the flexibility and to remove some of the trade barriers. So temporarily reducing, for instance, the import requirements and increasing the flexibility in accepting the e-documents, like the example that I shared earlier, which is the implementation of IPCC Phyto solutions. Now, in contrast, the volumes of the non-food agri-commodities like flowers, cotton, that fell quite significantly. Now, the key thing here is that I think this just illustrates the importance of keeping it simple, reducing the trade barriers, reducing the inequalities, and just allowing the producers to produce as efficiently as possible. And the key to that is really maintaining the transparency. So transparency and accessibility in terms of the technological advancements, transparency in terms of the pricing, transparency in terms of the processes. So this is where businesses can help. And we've seen many examples of that, where the large international organizations have extended the technological know-how to some of the smallholders, to the smaller farmers, to help them progress. They've also installed systems to share also the best practices, and also provided them access to the better fertilizers, better technology, better equipment. So these are some of the good examples that I see with my clients in terms of what they're doing to help the smallholders. And I can only encourage more people to do that.
Thank you. Jared, as many other activities, trade will create trade-offs, and many of those trade-offs could be in the environment. So how we can promote more environmentally sustainable food trade?
Thanks for the question. I think essentially it comes down to those comments I was making earlier, really, that trade can enable sustainability by ensuring that the right signals get transferred down to the production level. What we've seen is that a number of those domestic support policies, distorting domestic support policies and trade policies really shift us towards doing practices or undertaking agricultural practices in environments where it would be better to have them doing something different. And so really by allowing the global food system to adjust and ensure that and reward producers for their sustainable production, it'll help address some of those challenges that we see. I think part of the other things is to ensure that we have markets and a system where those rules reward sustainable behaviour, and making sure that different elements of our trade system, such as traceability and ensuring that those, I guess, attributes such as sustainability are rewarded in markets, and not diluted through different kind of, I guess, activities that occur across different countries.
Thank you so much. We only have 4 minutes left, and we have 4 speakers. So let me give 1 minute to each to answer about local versus global value chains. This has been a lot of discussion in the summit. So I just want to hear 2 or 3 words from each of you. What do you think of this? Should they be antagonistic? Should they complement each other? How we can take local versus global value chains? So let me start with Ambassador Parola.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for this meeting, for having me. I think they complement each other. I mean, local is not the opposite of global. They can build on one another. Local can benefit from global supply chains. It's a way to produce cheaper grains, cheaper food. So I don't see an inevitable contradiction between those 2 things. Should we try to make them contradictory, it will be to the detriment of people who need food at a cheaper price.
Thank you. Jane, sorry.
Thank you. Yes, I absolutely agree that the 2 are not antagonistic. In fact, I use the word symbiotic in my presentation. It isn't local versus international. It's local, regional, national, and international supply chains all working together. And this provides conduits for growers and farmers, whether they're sort of very small scale or much larger scale, to be able to access international markets if that's what they want to do, or to simply be able to sell their produce more easily to the domestic market. And I think in order to encourage both, we do need international rules, transparency, and predictability. Thank you.
Thank you. Lynn?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'm a huge believer in terms of the free market, demand and supply, and we really need to be nimble. As you can see from the COVID pandemic, sometimes the local supplies are not sufficient, and you need to supplement that with global trade. So I see that as symbiotic indeed, similar to Jane.
Thank you. Jared?
Yeah, I'll just agree with the other panelists in that sense. They're complementary, and in particular that we've noticed, if you look at some of the research on global value chains, is that countries which have established local or modern kind of value chain systems domestically also participate at a high degree into global value chains. And so I think it really shows that there's a symbiotic relationship there. And they can use both to ensure that we have food produced in an affordable way for consumers.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone for your questions, and we will keep answering them. They will record the questions and answer the ones that have not been answered. And thank you for the panelists. And in the last question, I think it will be important to bring as much evidence as possible. This is the end of our session, where we are pleased now to have the Director General, Dr. Manuel Otero, from the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, to deliver the closing remarks. Before doing so, I would like to thank our speakers today for their insights offered and the audience members for taking the time to attend today. So, Director General Otero, the floor is yours for the final wisdom.
Thank you, moderator, and also thank to the organizers of this event for giving me the honor of contributing and closing this important and rich discussion. This panel has put on the table a number of very important issues which are worth summarizing and communicated to the summit process for its adequate consideration. And I would summarize them under two main umbrellas. The first is that international trade is an essential component of food systems, connecting them, and by doing so, making them more efficient and sustainable in terms of economics. As Maximo said, trade means connecting people, being the best way to connect production with consumption. Our panelists have offered plenty of strong evidence and highlighted the role of trade in many areas, such as helping consolidate food and nutritional security, improving the access to food due to stable prices for the more disadvantaged sectors in society, allowing greater product diversity and more diversified diets, improving food safety as a result of the adoption of better standards in domestic production and distribution systems, improving productivity through economies of scale and technology transfer. In synthesis, we are talking of a better use of all global resources, natural, economic, and human. In this sense, the rapid response and adjustment to the new context presented by the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the resilience and efficiency of the food systems and why it is an essential sector that we should celebrate, reinforce, and obviously improve. In a second area of convergence to be highlighted is the importance of modernizing and strengthening the multilateral system and the promotion of national and international policies that promote the fluid and transparent trade systems. In this sense, a number of aspects were mentioned that were important to consider. These include trade liberalization and facilitation, the need for food safety and sanitary and phytosanitary regulations to be science-based, and most importantly, the need to avoid that sustainable requirements become new non-tariff trade restrictions, and the recognition that there are different pathways to achieve the proposed objectives. One size does not fit all approaches or needs. Finally, I would ask the permission of the chair to make a comment as how we in the Americas have come to a joint position regarding the role of trade in the transformation of food systems. After a long negotiation process involving a broad range of stakeholders, on June 28th, the ministers of agriculture of all 34 countries of the region have reached a consensus around a set of key 16 messages regarding the irreplaceable role of agriculture as a fundamental activity to eradicate poverty, promote rural development, and improve the environment. In the framework, message 4 refers to trade and rates. Open, transparent, and predictable international trade is essential for an efficient global food system and should be governed by multilateral rules and standards with a view to promoting agricultural trade liberalization and a reduction in tariff and non-tariff restrictions. The multilateral system should play an increasingly active role in limiting and reducing measures which distort trade and production, and ensure the adoption and application of science-based sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Therefore, from the perspective of the Ministry of Agriculture of the Western Hemisphere, trade is not just important, but it is vital for agriculture sustainability in all three of its pillars: social, environmental, and economic. Sure, our trade system should be improved and modernized for the 21st century, but this summit should work to reinforce it, ensure it is based on science, and provide a guidepost so that nations can continue to share their agricultural richness and abundance with the hungry world. Finally, from the comments shared with us today by the member of our panel, there seems to be a consensus that the preparatory process has not given trade-related issue the space it deserves, and this should be brought to the attention of the Secretariat so that an effort to better include is made during the remaining time before the summit next October. Many thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Director General. There is still time to coalesce and to work on this. I'd like to thank all of you for your time and for joining us. And I look forward to continuing to interact with all of you. Thank you.